Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at life in Nazi Germany. This time we're focusing on work and employment. One of the key reasons support for the Nazis increased in the 1930s was unemployment. The Wall Street crash and Great Depression had led to mass unemployment, drops in living standards and wages. Hitler had promised to reverse this, with posters like you see on the right there. "Our last hope, Hitler," it says, with a lot of very downtrodden and miserable looking workers in it. In 1933 there were 4.8 million unemployed Germans. By 1939 there were only 300,000 unemployed. That would suggest that there's a massive success. So had Hitler delivered on this promise, or was there more to it? Well, spoiler alert, yes, there's way more to it, but we need to dig down and see why. One of the first changes was the Reich Labour Service. In 1933 the first employment scheme was launched, the Reichsarbeitsdienst, or RAD for short. This was a scheme for providing work through infrastructure and repair projects, mending roads, planting trees and agricultural work, for example. While it started as a voluntary scheme, in 1935 it became compulsory for all young men to work in the RAD for 6 months. The similarity with military conscription didn't end there. The RAD lived in camps, had low wages and wore a uniform. They also did military-style marching and drill, like you can see with these workers carrying spades. All this made it unpopular, but numbers in the RAD reached 422,000 by 1935, probably helped by the fact that people had to join. One of the big schemes to create work was the Autobahns. This was a quick but temporary way to provide work. In 1933, construction started on the first of a series of Autobahns, what we would call motorways, with Hitler scooping the first turf. The first opened in 1935, and by 1938 3,800 kilometres had been built, employing 125,000 men. It was one of the first projects of its kind in the entire world. Better transport improved communications and trade. However, all was not as it seemed. Such infrastructure projects cost about 38 billion marks. Once the Autobahns were complete though, the workers needed to find alternative employment. A secret part of their purpose too was to enable faster military transport and mobilisation. Another quick win for employment was to rearm. This fulfilled several of the Nazis' election promises. One was overturning the Treaty of Versailles. The German army began to expand well beyond the 100,000 specified by the treaty, and in fact in truth this has happened at the end of the Weimar period too. And initially secret programmes to design new tanks, planes and submarines began. There were also new factory orders. Building weapons provided work and profits for German companies. And there was military employment. By 1939 there were 1.3 million soldiers in the German armed forces, who might otherwise have been unemployed. And there was factory employment. 3.5 billion marks was invested in arms building. There were 72,000 people building aircraft by 1939, for example, an increase of 68,000 since 1933. When war began in 1939, these figures increased even further. So employment increased. What about the standard of living? As is always the case, the standard of living was different for different people. Some found it improved, others less so. There were increases in employment, which led to more people getting regular pay. This was obviously very popular and one of the Nazis' main election promises. But this wasn't for everyone. Jews were often excluded from the workplace, and members of the RAD were typically miserable and poorly paid. Wages typically went up. There was a 20% rise in wages by 1939 compared to 1933. But this was offset by inflation. Prices of food and essentials rose by 45% in the same time, so most people experienced a cut of about 25% in real terms. In other words, they felt about a quarter poorer than they otherwise would have done. Workers in armaments industries saw pay improve the most, however, but there was little improvement for the labour service. However, more people could afford luxuries, like cars. But workers had to do more hours in order to do this. Typically, workers had to do 49 hours a week in return for their improved pay, compared to 43 hours before. However, as I warned earlier, things weren't exactly as they seemed. The Nazis were very good at disguising the scale of unemployment within their regime. Firstly, the RAD. Unemployed people were forced into the labour service. That meant that they were excluded from unemployment figures. And then there's rearmament. The armed forces accounted for millions of employed people, and many more were needed in war factories. However, in peacetime, this work wouldn't exist. There was also the exclusion of people. Women were forced or encouraged to give up work. Jews were excluded from working too by the end of this period. Hundreds of thousands were imprisoned. None of them counted towards employment figures. There were also Nazi jobs. Thousands were employed inefficiently in Nazi organisations that were very bureaucratic and required lots of paperwork. This included the SS, Gestapo and other ministries. And then there were the public projects. Work on ports, autobahns and airfields only created temporary work. When completed, the jobs disappeared. This was paid for by government spending, and that couldn't last forever. Frankly, if the war hadn't come in 1939, it's likely within a year or two the Nazis would have been back into some sort of unemployment crisis. Let's sum up. Reducing unemployment had been a key pledge of the Nazis in the early 1930s. The Reich Labour Service provided compulsory work with military discipline. Autobahns and other public works provided hundreds of thousands of jobs. Wages mostly went up. Rearmament provided work in factories and the armed forces. And unemployment dropped from 4.8 million in 1933 to 300,000 in 1939. And if we left it there, it would seem that the Nazis were incredibly successful. But all was not as it seemed. Workers worked longer hours and prices went up. Women and Jews were largely excluded from unemployment figures. Military and infrastructure projects were temporary and therefore unsustainable. And let's not forget the many people who had been imprisoned too. They didn't count towards the working figures either. So did the Nazis end unemployment, or was the war the only thing that prevented another wave of unemployment? I'll leave that down to your interpretation, but I know what I think. I think that the second thing, only the war prevented another wave of unemployment, which the Nazis would have found very tricky to solve. However, that's the end of this rapid revision video. I hope it's been useful to you, and if it has, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel too. I could really do with the support. I'm unable to monetize or promote many of these videos because of their subject content, which is all fair enough, but it does make it difficult to make these things worthwhile. However, if it has been useful to you, then it has been worthwhile. So thanks very much for watching, and goodbye.